it's hard to see at the moment that Netanyahu is going to fly anywhere where he's got any risk of being arrested. But there are people, where the long arm of the law, Rodrigo Duterte from Trump's first term was the president of the Philippines. He is facing war crimes now and is in The Hague. So these things are not impossible.
Is it naive to think that the Epstein files will ever see the light of day?
No, I think it's naive to think that you're going to learn everything, that there's going to be a wholesale distribution. I mean, the House of Representatives have subpoenaed the Department of Justice to hand over everything they've got. That ain't going to happen. Welcome to a special August Q&A edition of The Newsagents. Right, let's start with this question from Francis. Hi, Newsagents. Love the podcast. I have a question that's not very newsy. I hope that's okay. I enjoyed your mention of Dictionary Corner and Call My Bluff on Tuesday's episode, and it made me wonder, if you could host any TV show, past or present, which would it be? Well, I hope you enjoyed equally our singing of the theme tune.
Well, maybe we'll have to do that again, depending on the one we choose.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, I mean, honestly, there's just too many. As a true quiz show aficionado, there's just too many. There's too many. Countdown. I mean, obviously we talk about that. Love Countdown. The Krypton Factor.
Oh,
do you remember that, John?
Good, yeah.
Don't remember? Yeah, the Krypton Factor. What else would there be? Oh, I'd love to do the Crystal Maze. That would be great. Bring back the Crystal. I know that Richard guy does it, but I don't think he does it terribly well. I think I could do it a lot better.
Do you think you could see yourself as a quiz show host?
Oh, no, I've never thought about that, John. I definitely would not think.
He lied disingenuously.
I definitely wouldn't like that. What about you? Naked Attraction?
Yeah, that would be me.
Yeah.
No, I want to be Attenborough. I just want to be...
You want to be Attenborough.
And there we are, going through the jungle, and there's the lesser spotted Lewis Goodall approaching his etc.
No, I don't know. I could think... You wouldn't like a quiz show?
Yeah, I suppose... Look...
Millionaire?
Yeah, who wants to be...
News at 10?
Your final word?
News at 10? Fancy a bit of that?
No. Boring.
No, boring. A man who spent virtually his entire career on the News at 10 decides that, in fact, that is quite boring at this point.
But I think being a correspondent, great, where you're telling the stories, and if you're just reading an introduction and saying, here's this report from Lewis Goodall.
There's your headline, Daily Mail. John Sopel, News at 10, boring.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
And I've probably just got myself into a whole heap of trouble for decrying all my former colleagues at the BBC and at ITV who read the news. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, you're not resiling from it, are you? You're not apologising for it.
Not really.
Sticking with it. Yeah, well, fair play. Thomas Ireland has sent a question and has said this. I graduated from university last week with a first in genetics. All right, Tom. All right.
Don't get boastful.
Yeah. Yeah, show off. Thank you for being my go-to study podcast. What about genetics?
When have we ever discussed genetics on this podcast?
Not enough, as far as I'm concerned. My question is, do you think if Reform or the new Corbyn Sultana Party won a general election, there would actually be dramatic policy changes that they would campaign for? Has the public's tolerance for radical change opened up enough, or would it just be a Liz Truss-style blip before a return to a more moderate, technocratic style of the major parties?
That's a great question. I suspect the problem would be that if you go in with a whole heap of pledges that the markets think are nonsense or unfunded, then you get the bond markets reacting. And, there's that great quote from James Carville, I thought I wanted to be reincarnated as the Pope or a king, but I realise now I want to come back as the bond markets because you can intimidate everybody. I don't think that a Jeremy Corbyn Sultana government would be immune from that. And they exist in a real world, in an interconnected, globalised world. And I just don't think they would be able to do whatever they wanted in that narrow sense without facing a likely economic crisis in the same way that Liz Truss with her unfunded tax cuts did.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really sad, disturbing, worrying, but nonetheless, I think, immovable trends of contemporary British politics is the rise again of the bond markets. It was something that was more prevalent in other parts of post-war British history, particularly the 1970s. But it is true that, Britain is more indebted than it has ever been. Debt servicing our debt is now pretty much the third or fourth biggest government department in terms of spending, depending on how you measure it. And I know there'll be people listening to this who say, no, this is a sort of very conventional way of looking at economics. You can have MMT, modern monetary theory. The government can just print its own money. And yes, there are, of course, different versions of macroeconomics that you could try to experiment with. But it is undoubtedly the case, and I think it is unarguable, that we are not in the mid-2010s anymore. In the mid-2010s, when in the era of loose monetary policy, in the era of record low interest rates, there was far more capacity, with such demand for government bonds and government debt existed at that time. There was far more capacity for states, for governments that were indebted, to borrow cheaply and to finance their debt inexpensively, which opened up a whole range of policy positions. When Corbyn ran in 2017, I would say both Brexit and Corbynism were in their own ways, and it's a slightly indirect thing, but I would say that they were in their own ways products of that era, of that cheap money era, because you could do things like Brexit, which were clearly a macroeconomic risk, and you could do it with reasonable certainty that it wasn't going to be, the bond markets weren't going to come for you for indulging in that risk. Likewise, when Corbynism was at its peak in 2017, you could pledge to do many of the things that he wanted to do with increased borrowing and it not seem like a systemic risk to the economy. We are in a different economic era now, and as we saw with the Truss experiment and so on, I think we would potentially see again with Corbyn. He would be governing in very different circumstances to when he looked like he was close to governing in 2017.
I mean, look, you've seen that report this week about the size of the black hole that Rachel Reeves is going to have to fill when she does her budget. You know, there's a 40 billion, black hole that needs to be addressed. You can't just will these things away. And I think that were she to announce that there was going to be a massive increase in taxation on this, well, then she'd be probably breaking her manifesto pledges. If she was to come up with other taxes, it would probably be unworkable. If she was to come up with a massive kind of increase in borrowing, then the cost of government bonds, selling government bonds, would go up and up and up, and so that the debt would become unsustainable. I mean, this is just the real world that you're living in. And so I think that, and equally, you know, even if it's let's just say it's a Farage government and Reform has won the election and Farage wants to get rid of all the kind of, you know, illegal immigrants. As you said earlier on in the week, Lewis, well, what are you going to do? Throw them out of parachute, throw them out of planes and drop them onto Afghanistan?
Yeah.
I mean, there are no easy answers to some of these problems. And that's the problem of the crisis, it would seem to me, of politics at the moment, that you have got people wanting more and more radical solutions and governments less and less able to shape how they can do things. Kind of, you just can't pull levers in the way that, you know, of yore that you thought politicians were able to do to suddenly dramatically change course.
Yeah, I mean, the closest equivalent I think that there would be, and because there is some history of this happening before, would be what happened to the Mitterrand government, the French Mitterrand government in the early 80s, which again was elected on I mean, it's a bit anachronistic, but you could broadly say a sort of Corbynite kind of type of politics. So certainly a more, you know, hard left kind of politics. And that government struggled precisely because at that time France, not as indebted then as it is now, but the bond markets did come for them, and it did force a profound change in reversal in the sort of Keynesian left-wing statist economic policies that Mitterrand was pursuing. Now, Mitterrand went on to be re-elected and was a successful French president, but there is, for people who sort of would doubt the sort of things that we're saying, there is history to it. Now, I think what Corbyn would do, and I think the way in which he would be different to Starmer and certainly, sort of Liz Truss, both radical in their own ways, is that clearly he would be far more interested in more aggressive wealth taxation, more aggressive income taxation. He would expand the percentage of the economy that was devoted to state spending. Again, it would be an interesting experiment, and I think there are things you could definitely do on wealth taxation. But of course, you know, we are dealing in an era of where capital is mobile, people may leave. You know, there are trade-offs in all of these things. But doubtless, you know, Corbyn would be able to do things, and I think you would certainly see big changes in, or some changes at least in terms of foreign policy. You'd see a more radical left foreign policy, things that were cheap to do. I think there'd be a lot of symbolic things. When Corbyn, I remember asking Corbyn once, what would the first thing that he would have done if he'd won the 2017 election? And people forget now, he was only 10 or 15 seats away from becoming the largest party, or at least being able to form a government. Theresa May, if she'd lost another 10 seats, she wouldn't have been able to form a deal with the DUP. He said he would have, stood outside the steps of Downing Street and had said, homelessness is going to end tonight. No one will be homeless. Councils will be obliged to take people. I think you would see those sort of slightly more micro, but nonetheless important, big sort of symbolic actions. But in terms of the wider macroeconomic picture, a Corbyn government would struggle, just as this government is struggling, and any incoming government would struggle with all of the problems we're seeing.
It's interesting to look at it through the historical lens and say, well, okay, where was there a radical change of government after a general election? I mean, the most radical change of government was not after a general election. It was when Liz Truss became Prime Minister and she suddenly introduced her budget, which was suddenly completely outlandish. But, the move from John Major to Tony Blair.
45, probably, right?
Yeah, 45. 45, the establishment of the health service.
79 from Callaghan
But
to
79, the radical change didn't come immediately.
No, but everyone knew that there would be a substantial change in approach, at least.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue there that, but for the Falklands War, buttressing, Thatcher's position, she'd have lost in 2003. It was that she went to the country in 2003, having won the Falklands War, and then she was able to really introduce the kind of what we come to associate now as the Thatcherite reforms.
Well, like I say, I think the closest in the modern era we would have come to would have been 2017. We were very close to it, and it's very fashionable to decry Corbyn and to say that he was a political failure, and of course his leadership ultimately was a political failure. People do forget now. Astonishingly, he got 40% of the vote in 2017. He was this close to becoming Prime Minister, and that would have been a very radical change from the Theresa May government, and that's why I think one of the reasons I don't think he should be underestimated, actually.
For those of us listening and not watching it, when Lewis Goodall was saying it was this close, he had his thumb and his forefinger, and they were very short distance apart.
Yep, something I do a lot. Yep, watch on YouTube. Well, that was a deep analysis there from your local friendly podcast geneticist, John Sokol, Lewis Goodall, otherwise known as the Crick and Watson of political podcasting.
Also, why? Look, I don't, Thomas. Congratulations on your first. But did we need to know you got a first? I mean, did it add to your point?
Don't lay into it that much. We've done it already. I mean, honestly, the poor lad, he's just proud of his first. Good on him. Well, he'll probably be treating you. Not that you've got genetic problems, I assume, but I mean, he might be treating you at some point.
Future day. Might be treating you at future day.
Well, I do have genetic problems. Now, Paul Graham has sent us a voice note and a question.
Hi guys, Paul here. Firstly, I just want to say I absolutely love your relationship, Lewis and John. You have me crying laughing sometimes. You're like a modern day Listen Large. Anyway,
Little Large.
Seriously, Benjamin Netanyahu. Do you think that we could ever see him being arrested for war crimes? Do you think it's in the near future, or do you think if he's ever gotten out of office, he could get arrested and put away? Again, just want to say, love the show, and good luck with today's Q&A.
That really is a question in two halves, isn't it?
Because a bit of a gear change from Paul.
It was a gear change from the glorious relationship of. I mean, I think it's
large. Lovely to hear.
Yeah,
Little and large.
What next? Maybe that's the TV show we go back to.
Yeah. Abbott and Costello.
I mean, Lewis,
Abbott and Portillo.
It's fair to say you sometimes have me crying, rarely crying, laughing. But
anyway, okay.
There we are.
Let's not get into that.
I mean, it's hard to see at the moment that Netanyahu is going to fly anywhere where he's got any risk of being arrested. I mean, there was the whole example of Pinochet coming to London and being arrested, and the kind of enormous diplomatic incident that followed from that. But there are people, I mean, where the long arm of the law, Rodrigo Duterte from Trump's first term was the president of the Philippines. He is facing war crimes now and is in The Hague. So these things are not impossible. And I think that the legacy of Netanyahu is, I mean, we discussed it on the podcast on Tuesday, is pretty horrific for what he has done and what he has done in a bid to keep himself in power and away from these corruption charges.
Yeah, I find it hard to see the circumstances. I
Yeah.
don't know about you. I mean, obviously Israel isn't signatory to the Rome Statute, which is the treaty that established the ICC. So even if there were a future government in Israel that had a very different view about what happened, they'd have to sign up to the ICC, which feels extremely unlikely. The US obviously isn't either. Obviously, if he ever comes to the UK, then the government at that time would, according to the treaty at least, be obliged to start the processes of his arrest. But I think that is one of the many reasons why Netanyahu will never come to the UK or anywhere else other than the United States and Israel again, possibly for the rest of his life. But I find it...
Which in itself is remarkable. He was a regular visitor to this country. There is a significant Jewish population in London, but he's not going to London. He's not going to Paris. He's not going to... all these countries...
You're totally right. We've become slightly inured to the idea of an Israeli prime minister being basically forbidden.
Yes.
Because of the nature of international law and our membership of the ICC, not being able to travel to a country like the UK, unimaginable a few years ago.
And that in itself is, I bet it hurts. I bet it is a source of shame. I bet among Israelis, they will hate the idea that they are becoming a pariah state. And I do think this is kind of, there is a pressure building. I mean, we discussed on the podcast the other day what's going on in Israel, and I met someone this morning whose cousin is Israeli. They said to me he will go to prison rather than go back into Gaza. He will be a conscientious objector. I think that there is things happening there. As we said on the podcast the other day, Israel is not Benjamin Netanyahu.
Indeed. Matthew Hulbert has sent a question saying, why are the Lib Dems largely... No compliment from Matthew, by the way, as well. So I'm almost loath to read it out, either about our genetics expertise or our comedy material. Why are the Lib Dems, Matthew, I'll be generous, largely ignored by the media when they are the largest Commons third force in a century? Or is moderation too unsexy for the increasingly clickbaity media of today? Thanks. And it's interesting you should ask that, Matthew. I know for a fact from conversations I've had with very senior Lib Dems that they are very pissed off about this, that they believe that, particularly with the BBC, but others as well, that they feel that there is such agitation, there is such a desire from the BBC and others to prove that they are not ignoring Reform and Nigel Farage, that they are ignoring their obligations to other parties. And don't get me wrong, it is a tough thing to calibrate because you have two slightly competing imperatives. On the one hand, you've got the fact that Reform are, in Commons terms, tiny. They sort of hover around because various different MPs get suspended at different times, but at any given moment they're between sort of 4 and 6. And then you've got that Lib Dems, who, as Matthew rightly says, they're the biggest Commons third party force in the Commons since the 1920s, not able to, apparently ignored. I mean, I was very struck the other day that when Farage was doing one of his press conferences, and he was saying very little. He was just talking about his latest plans on this, that, or the other, but it was pretty sort of minor stuff.
And it was
being carried live by Sky and the BBC. And, there's no way in a million years that if Ed Davey were getting up and just having a press conference and it wasn't something reasonably substantial, it wouldn't be covered live. I have some sympathy for broadcasters trying to kind of calibrate this, but I think the calibration is too far in one direction at the moment.
Do you know what? Years and years ago, when the BBC did the live coverage on BBC One and BBC Two of the party conferences, and I used to kind of present that coverage, there was a dinner that the then director...
Is that boring or not boring?
No, it's great, actually. I have all
if it
sorts
had been
of
the 10 o'clock news, it would have been boring.
Because you're kind of doing the interviews about what the issues are and the policies and the like. Yeah. But I remember once there was a dinner that John Birt, when he was the Director General of the BBC, giving, which I was invited to, and the Liberal Democrat leader comes along to this dinner, and John Birt said to him, right, should we leave our guns just outside the door and we could just sit and have a civilised dinner? Because the Liberal Democrats, I think, have always felt that they have been given a bad treatment by conventional broadcasters because they're neither one thing nor the other. And I think that the clickbaity point is true, that we want to hear from Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn, and we want to hear from Nigel Farage because of the progress that Reform is being made. And we do give the impression that unless you've got an extreme point of view to articulate, then frankly, yeah, we'll cover the Labour and we'll cover the Tories, but we're not really interested in anybody else.
Yeah, and I think this is why this deficit of coverage is one of the reasons why, if you ask sort of Lib Dem aides and operatives, obviously Davey got some criticism from the way he conducted the 2024 general election. You know, there wasn't a log flume in Britain that wasn't graced by the Lib Dem, Lib Dem leaders behind, but it was nonetheless an attempt from them to break through in a way that did not indulge in some of those, you know, deeply kind of simplistic and populist messaging, but nonetheless created some attention, created some interest, connected with people. And I sort of felt kind of two things at once about it. I thought I could totally see it. And it was very effective. It was really effective. It generated loads of publicity. It was great social media content and so on. It was also a little bit depressing at the same time that a leader of a party with the historic stature of the Lib Dems or the Liberals before would feel compelled or obliged to have to do it. But that is the sort of media environment we're in. But yeah, I think it is not, by the way, a discontent or an unhappiness that is shared or is had by the Lib Dems alone. Other smaller parties, and indeed even the Labour and Conservative parties, have some complaint with the level and volume of coverage that Farage achieves. That is partly to Farage's political credit that he's able to do it. He does know he's a skilled player of the game at this, but I think it is undoubtedly true that some of it is being generated and born from a worrying concern of being seen not to cover them, and there is an overcorrection and overcompensation.
It's the self-apologetic aspect of the media where we got it wrong on Brexit. We didn't realise what the country was thinking. We didn't realise that the people were so concerned about immigration as they were. If Nigel Farage says something, we've got to cover it because we'll then be accused of being the mouthpiece of mainstream politics. And I think that it's gone just a touch too far where Farage opens his mouth and he gets on the television regardless. So let us crack on. We've got a voice note from Sean.
Hello, Jon, Emily and Lewis. This is Sean from Newcastle. Firstly, thank you for the brilliant podcast. I'm eagerly awaiting Lewis's John Sopel biography. My question relates to RFK Jr., who's the current health secretary in America. This week he announced a withdrawal of $500 million of funding for the development of mRNA vaccines, which comes after he fired all 17 committee members that issue official government recommendations on immunisations, with some people who have criticised the safety and effectiveness of vaccinations. My question is, how does this impact those of us outside the US? And is this likely to lead to more research and development taking place outside the States? Finally, is there any opposition to the changes in the US, or are RFK Jr.'s vaccine sceptic views generally accepted? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Keep up the great work. Thanks.
A nice compliment there. That's very, very important.
So
let others learn from that.
Oh, right. So we're only going to include questions now where people are sycophantic or saying
To be honest, I thought that was a policy position we already possessed. I'm amazed that some have slipped through the net.
So you've either got to be complimentary or have a first in genetics.
Yeah, something like that. We're getting a few messages from various TV news presenters, by the way, as we're going through there, calling you a complete wanker. Mark Austin says you're a total prick.
Yeah, I know.
Tom Bradby says, honestly, who the hell does this guy think he is? Fuck off. Even Trevor McDonald's got involved, honestly. We're getting some bile in for you, honestly. Anyway,
Jan Leeming, has she commented yet?
Not yet, but we've sent the word out, so we'll get that. We'll get her comments before the end. Yeah, Moira Stewart as well, by the way. Yeah, we're still waiting to hear from her. Do we think it has much of an effect outside the US?
I can't remember what the question was.
Well, my question is, does this impact those of us outside the US? Is in his vaccine scepticism and what he's done in terms of funding?
Well, I suspect that some of the big pharma companies, if they've kind of thinking, well, the grants have dried up here, and if you're at universities and you were getting grants from the US, and you suddenly might start thinking, I wonder whether I'd be better off in Canada or London or anywhere else where you've got great seats of learning and you've got a history of academic research. I think it's incredibly short-sighted. I mean, I do think RFK Jr. is a fascinating Health and Human Services Secretary because on the one hand, you've got the kind of appalling vandalism of just saying, right, we're going to take all this money out of mRNA research, when the vaccines allowed a lot of us to kind of resume normal life post-COVID. But he's also doing some really interesting work in terms of wanting to take on, big ag, big pharma, the food industry and the like. And so I think his kind of legacy is pretty mixed.
Yeah, I actually think that long after the Trump administration has shuffled off into the far distance of history, I think that one of the things that will, the most impactful legacies that will linger for a long time is the effect on scientific research and so on that happened really early on with Doge and Musk shutting off federal funding to Harvard and other research institutions. There was so much going on in those early days, but I remember being so struck by some of the reporting that was coming out, talking about, astonishing work on cancer and treatments for cancer, being stopped in their tracks, MS, other degenerative diseases, just being stopped either because people were losing their visas, either because federal funding was disappearing. And as you say, John, that stuff, once it's gone, and it's not easy to pick up again. And there'll be such reluctance from the leading research scientists of the world and so on to resume their work in the United States, because even if, let's say, I don't know, Gavin Newsom becomes president or whoever in 2028, there's always that lingering sense and worry about whether science in the US is going to be has become so partisan. Views on science has become so highly partisan that they are going to be in a permanent political environment which is just polarized and which is going to be a sort of systemic risk to scientific research over the long term. And you have to do it over the long term because scientific research doesn't fit neatly into electoral cycles. It takes place over years and years and decades.
You look at the treatment of Anthony Fauci, who was the head of the kind of spearhead, the medical lead in the fight against COVID-19. He'd also done AIDS research. He was an astonishing public servant. His commitment was to public health of the United States of America and the rest of the world.
Under presidents of both parties.
Under presidents
decades.
of both parties, he had been, brilliant during the Bush era, Obama era, and suddenly he is now a political football requiring bodyguards 24/7. And you just think, why would anyone who put themselves forward for that? Why don't I just have a private list of patients who I'll see, I'll make a ton of money, I'll join the country club, but I won't get the shit that I'm going to get by being part of the, in the crosshairs of a partisan country which sees scientists as part of that political football. Yeah,
is it likely, and in terms of answering the question about is there opposition within the US, it's like, yeah, of course, but that's the point. It starts to divide down partisan lines. And thank God, we haven't had that to nearly the same extent in this country or in Europe, but you see glimmers of it. And I think that's one of the ways in which the RFK stuff does affect us. It's not so much directly in terms of the development of vaccines and so on, although doubtless there will be medical treatments, as we say, which are never developed or are delayed substantially, which would eventually have been rolled out to us. So that will affect us. But I think the general kind of anti-science sort of discourse, the sort of sense that science becomes polarized, it does obviously legitimize, when you have someone like Trump or someone like RFK at that level of the American government, it legitimizes this stuff. And we see it in the effect of that in the politics of our own country. It's a slow thing, but it legitimizes it in a way that it would not have been legitimized or widespread only a few years ago.
Look at the uptake of the measles vaccine.
Yeah.
I mean, does anyone want a return of measles being widespread with the devastating effects that can have? And yet, at the moment, the numbers of people getting their kids vaccinated with MMR is in decline. And you just think, this is terrible. Yeah. This is madness.
Question from Ace. 1980s Doctor Who companion, of course, Ace. Played by
Ace, also a band of the 1980s.
Ace of Base?
Ace.
Oh, just Ace?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Hang on. What's the song?
We're not going to sing again, are we?
Yeah, we're going to sing.
Oh, okay, fine. Yeah. Now, Ace, played by the great Sophie Aldred, if you're listening, Sophie. Anyway, is it naive to think that the Epstein files will ever see the light of day?
No, I think it's naive to think that you're going to learn everything, that there's going to be a wholesale distribution. I mean, the House of Representatives have subpoenaed the Department of Justice to hand over everything they've got. That ain't going to happen. I think there'll be, there'll be highlights of grand jury testimony, which we already sort of know about, which led to the prosecution of Ghislaine Maxwell, which was the case that was going to be made against Jeffrey Epstein if he hadn't killed himself in prison or been murdered. Let's feed the conspiracy theories. But I don't think that they were going to hand over anything that could be in any way compromising to Donald Trump or embarrassing to Donald Trump. I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, it seems so. I mean, when you consider just how profoundly damaging this entire episode has been to Trump. The only thing that's really touched the sides since his restoration and re-election, and even that is just so interesting, right? Like the MAGA movements, the MAGA movement being the MAGA movement learning that if you live by the sword, you die by the sword.
Exactly.
And that you, in the end, you can rail against the establishment and you can create this politics of conspiracy and paranoia and augment the deep sense of paranoia that has always been in American politics. And you can ride that wave and you can ride that wave and you can ride that wave. And then you become the political establishment. You become the state. And then suddenly those exact forces, those same forces don't just go away. I almost felt sorry for Trump. I didn't, but I had a sort of rueful laugh when he was saying the other day that everybody just needs to sort of stop asking these questions. It's just getting silly now. It's like, well, you can't. You know, you've opened Pandora's box, or at the very least, you've ridden this wave. And when you become the establishment, when you become the state, you find yourself subject to exactly those same pressures and exactly that paranoid style that you have done so much to heighten and to augment. And there is a sort of poetic justice to that.
Yeah, there is nothing more deep state in a conspiracy theorist's mind than to say there is nothing to see here. And that is exactly what Donald Trump is trying to say to the American public. Oh, move on. Nothing to see here. It's all nothing.
It's like that old joke about conspiracy theorists. You know, that one about... you know, the one about conspiracy theorists dying.
Goes to heaven.
Yeah,
sees
conspiracy
God.
theorist goes to heaven, sees God.
I've been dying to tell this joke on the podcast.
But do you want to tell it? I'll let you do it. As out of deference to your age, John.
Conspiracy theorist dies, goes to heaven, and God says to him, "You've got one question." And the guy scratches his head and says, "Okay, who killed JFK?" And God says to him, "It was Lee Harvey Oswald, and he acted alone." And the guy looks aghast and says, "This goes even deeper than I thought."
And it is that sort of comedy styling that makes us one of the unparalleled comedy duos of our age.
Right, before we go, a question from Josh. It feels like we're living in really dangerous times with seemingly greater global tensions and nations at war than at any time I can remember. So I wonder when you think, within the last, say, 100 years, global tensions were at their calmest and the world was seeing the fewest active wars. And importantly, do you think we were aware of it at the time?
This is a really, really interesting question. And it gets to the heart of something that I think is a real narrowness of our politics, our media, and also, going back a little bit to the discussion we had on Hiroshima earlier in the week, the narrowness of our understanding of history, because it is received wisdom, and it's been very commonplace to say that, you know, we're living in times of almost unprecedented uncertainty, a time of polycrisis, you know, where there's just crisis everywhere and it's all linked. And of course, things are profoundly uncertain. There is huge geopolitical tension. It can be scary. I'm not sure, though, that by comparison to much of the 20th century, with perhaps the exemption, and I think this is where a lot of this is coloured from, the late 1990s, pre-2001, actually, you can point, I think, we could sit here and go through each decade of the 20th century, and you can point to endless crisis. You can point to endless geopolitical uncertainty, even in eras and periods which we think of somehow as sort of being grey and dull. People often talk about the 1950s, for example, and this rising consumer kind of wave and all that's true. But you also have the Korean War. You have the prospect of nuclear conflagration between the Soviet Union and the United States. To take another one people always talk about, they talk about the Edwardian period and the kind of golden summer of that time. Did not feel like that. If you were living then in Britain, you had you had, you know, huge geopolitical tension with the rising the United States and Germany. You had, you know, massive kind of conflagrations at home with kind of, you know, protests over rights to women and suffragettes. You had, you know, massive industrial discontent with, you know, rising trade union movements. You go forward to the 1920s, you have the general strike. You have Ireland basically coming to almost civil war in the 1910s. So if you were, I think, sitting in almost any age, you don't sit there and go, we're in a golden age of relative prosperity and stability. There is always in any era, and often in any era, profound unease and angst about the future, because that is what we're like as human beings, and a lot of tension within the geopolitical system. So sometimes I think we almost aggrandize ourselves to believe that we are living in uniquely difficult times. And actually, I think that often, if you look through history, is not the case.
So I would say that, the year you were born, 1989, felt like a year of optimism. When the Iron Curtain came down, the Soviet Union collapsed. There was a kind of move towards democracies. Francis Fukuyama wrote this kind of book, which The End of History, and people thought, it's the triumph of liberal democracy, and we all live happily ever after, which of course it didn't turn out to be. But there was a kind of, growing up, and we talked the other day on the podcast about Hiroshima and the effect of that. I grew up kind of very aware of the every time there was a sort of rise in tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States of America, and could this lead to nuclear war, and the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 or whatever it happened to be, there would be these things, fixed points where you think, oh my God, are we, and then there'd be these kind of books about how to protect and survive and what you to do in the event of a nuclear war. It felt at the 1990s that the risk of that had depleted considerably. It felt like we were then living in a unipolar world, that the Soviet Union had collapsed, that China wasn't the great power that it is today, and that American hegemony was there to stay. And of course, look, within Europe, there was the kind of breakup of Yugoslavia, which caused the most terrible kind of fighting, but it was pretty localized. It didn't feel like it was ever going to spread to anywhere, that was going to affect your life. And I think it did feel, and of course, 9/11 was the kind of, okay, we're in a new century now, and it's been defined by what happens on 9/11 with those planes flying into the World Trade Center and the like. And so I think there was a brief period then when you could breathe a little easier, and governments were taking decisions, right, well, we don't need, the old biblical line of turning swords into plowshares.
Yeah, the peace dividend. Yeah.
The peace dividend.
No, I agree. Obviously the period in the late 90s was a period of unusual stability. It was a very rare moment of unipolar power. These moments don't exist very often, where there is one power that is so hegemonic that it's able to create order. And the world, in a way, the word which epitomizes our own period, it feels, is disorder. And it feels as if, the world is increasingly disorderly. There's also, which is probably unique, the threat of climate change, which is so systemic and overwhelming that previous periods have not had. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is exactly that. The period of order, of geopolitical order and stability, which did exist in the late 90s for a few years, smattering of years, that is the aberration. That is the abnormality. Actually, generally speaking, if you take the sweep of modern history, certainly in the 20th century, but even before, generally speaking, there is not a hegemonic power. British Empire was for large periods of the 19th century. Yes, we had the United States at the end of the 20th century. But actually, what there generally is, what history is usually characterized by, is geopolitical tension between established powers and rising powers. That is a tale as old as history itself. And more than that, history is usually characterized by ideological contestation of big ideas being fought between states for dominance and for their own, to try and project their own vision of order. That's what we saw in the Cold War between the United States, capitalism and communism with the Soviet Union. We're seeing that different forms of global order on display from China and the United States in our own era. That is normal. And it sometimes sort of annoys me when people almost complain about the times that we're in as if something is unusual about it. Actually, the times we're living in now would be far more familiar to, say, someone who is living in the 1920s or 1930s, 1960s, or even, the early 1980s than the late 1990s would have been.
We will be back. Thank you for all your questions. Remember, compliments and only people with first-class honours degrees need apply. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.